We've been talking to Stephen Aperen, who's a behavioural scientist or an analyst, and we were talking about a host of different things in our first interview. And I did ask him about whether or not he believed if Lindy Chamberlain was guilty or not guilty. And he said to me that he would explain to me in due course whether it was one or the other. So let's come to that. When you first saw the story, when it emerged, you would have been part of the police force in South Australia at the time?
I'm just trying to think.
Would have been the early 80s?
No, just before I joined.
Just before you joined,
yep.
Okay. So what did you
I joined
make
in
of
84.
That? What did you make of that case then? Because it's been going with us, it's been living with us for the better part of the last 40 years.
The first time I saw it, and by the way, this was before I did all my training in the States,
sure,
the FBI.
Sure. So you would have been like the rest of the public?
Yep. I looked at it and I thought, total lack of emotion, no crying. And I remember specifically her standing out the steps of the court explaining with absolutely no emotion how a dingo would have ripped the suit. And most people would have watched that and said, oh, she's heartless, there's no emotion. However, the problem I've got with that is, as a uniformed police officer delivering a death message, people react differently. You never know how someone is going to react.
You would have seen a great many different responses.
Absolutely.
Huh?
I've seen people, devastated, cry, laugh, a range of emotions because they're going through a range of emotions.
Sure.
So you can't convict on the fact that you may not react the same way I do. So we live in a society, we're looking for forensic, scientific, medical.
But we live in a
evidence.
society where we judge instantly.
We do.
We do it on social media.
We do.
There is what do they say, the 10-second rule? Write it down, think about it, count to 10, and dump it, or post it.
Yeah.
And more people are posting than ever before. What do we need to do to change our behaviour? Because so often, I think we're doing the wrong thing. We're really with a couple of coping tools, we could improve immeasurably. And I still want an answer on the Lindy Chamberlain.
Well, insofar as coping, everyone has coping mechanisms. I don't mind admitting, I still have nightmares of things cases, homicides that I worked on. And everyone has their own structure. For me, it's golf and photography, getting out, and just every time that phone rings, it's bad news. So I try to disassociate. Now, I defy anyone who worked in homicide cases not to have some degree of emotional feelings or whatever. It's very hard just to cut off, and I don't think I've ever met anyone who could do that successfully. So I think how I do is I like to put things in perspective. So, when I think, negative thoughts or when I'm down, I like to think of how other people who are really struggling, and then it snaps you into reality. You think, geez, you hear terrible stories of famine, you hear violence and things like that, and you think, even though sometimes it feels like the world's crashing around you, and people's resilience is somewhat lacking, because I remember, when we were kids, we'd fall over, graze, and get up and get on with it.
Absolutely.
Now we see, parents suing schools because they're helicopter parenting and their children are not getting the results or the marks, and they're blaming the school. So I think what we need to do is take some sort of assessment of ourselves and then put it into perspective and think, I honestly believe 90% of the stuff that we worry about never eventuates. And we put ourselves, and we know through research that every person has an abundance of negative thoughts. We think about negative thoughts. It's just...
Is that how we're wired?
Yeah, we are. Absolutely. For survival.
I was going to say, I used to remember getting a lot of fan mail when I was in the early days of SBS. And our department would say, look, we don't recommend you read them. And we certainly don't recommend that you respond to any of them. We'll respond for you. But I would read a few. They would hand me some that would come through. And what was interesting, you'd get 100 letters, for example, and 93, 95 were extraordinarily positive. Yeah, you're buoyant. And there'd be 1, 2 or 3
that you focus on.
Yeah. And why is that? Why do we so naturally go to the negative? It's an extraordinary thing, isn't it?
Yeah. Oh, we know through science that when people like a comment, there's a release of endorphins and we feel good. But we, as humans, we want to be liked. We want to be part of a social cohesion. We want friends. We want to be able to express. And this is one of the problems we're having in Victoria with isolation and whatnot. And when, as humans, we are social beings. We like to congregate. We like to communicate and talk and stuff like that. So it is an issue that we focus on the negative, but we allow that to actually overtake the positive, and that's how we are wired. So, and that's why in times of what we're going through here in Victoria, stress, it actually perpetuates. And sometimes, and research has shown that sometimes we actually can conjure a situation in our mind that's actually worse than the actual or the reality.
Now, is that done for survival instinct?
Well, I think,
or is it a case of we're losing the access to relieve it? As you said earlier, you play golf, or you're into photography. They're two of your coping mechanisms.
Yep.
Now, one of the things I learned after nearly 40 years on the news desk was that at times when I'd go to the cinema in the dark, different emotions from the screen would fire up different responses in me. It was almost like I was suffering from a form of PTSD, where from years of holding back the emotion in that darkness, I could let it all out. Yeah, and I'm just wondering right now, so many Victorians are having to hold it in. They're having to rein in what is normal and be sociable. And it must be an extraordinarily difficult time to actually cope. Do you get a sense of that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, add on top of that, loss of jobs, loss of income, bills coming in, family pressures. I mean, we've seen increases in domestic violence, self-harm. We've got all these.
It is a pressure cooker, isn't it?
Absolutely. And, we're not seeing hope from our leaders, from the government. So we're here in Victoria, we've got to a stage where people are telling me that they can't even watch Daniel Andrews because he comes across as lacking that empathy and not taking responsibility. So I think as humans, we want to see a sense of light at the end of the tunnel.
You said earlier in our first discussion, you look at the way people express themselves under duress. You look for tells, you look at the way they say what they say. One of the things that bothers me is watching the Premier, and when he's talking about the death toll, he says he's sending best wishes to people, to the families, instead of saying condolences or our deepest sympathies. What does that signify, you using that sort of language, which to me is not the language that I would suggest or recommend to anyone?
The feedback I'm getting is he seems disconnected.
Does he do that for his sanity?
I think that's part of his personality. I really do. I think that's he's. I mean, if you are going to show empathy, it's like sincerity. If you are going to mock sincerity, you need to be damn good at it, because people know when you're sincere and when you're insincere. So it's almost like a facade insofar delivering the numbers, making the condolences, all the rest of it, and then having this degree of power or control in delivering the message. Now, without getting all the politics, I think it's part of his personality and his makeup that he won't admit, whether he's wrong. You've got to look at it from the perspective of why do people do what they do? Why do people lie? I like to look at the motivation of what makes people tick. Why do people do it?
People lie to make it easier, don't they? It's a white lie. I'm going to tell you that I've been having a reasonably good week, because I don't want to tell you I've had a fantastic week and make you feel totally insecure, because I know that you're going through bad times.
Yep.
So there's a bit of that, I suppose.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And as humans, we try to minimise, justify and rationalise our behaviour. And when we are in a situation, going back to the lying, I mean, you look at the reasons we lie. We lie to impress, we lie to get ahead, we lie to impress a potential partner. And these, you're right, these are little white lies.
Yeah.
But the problem is when it gets to a stage where it becomes either sociopathic or it gets to a stage where the facade looks so preposterous that they maintain that. But you've got to look at the reason why. And obviously, he'll come up and say things like, oh, you know, he'll actually blame Victorians who are doing the right thing. When really, you speak to a lot of people, they talk about isolation. Isn't isolation to protect the most vulnerable?
Yes.
So why is the majority of the population being penalised when they're doing a couple of people, some people are doing stupid things, but the majority of the population doing the right thing. So it's almost like A, there's no hope, B, no light at the end of the tunnel, C, being blamed for a position that we actually feel that we've been placed in, and then add on top of that loss of job, income and all that. Of course there are people out there who are feeling down and depressed.
Just before we wrap this up, we go back to the Lindy Chamberlain story. So, innocent, guilty. When did you start seeing a variation in what you felt was a more reasonable and a closer assessment of Lindy Chamberlain?
I think with the advancements in scientific methodologies, DNA, because
and your training, I suppose. More experience that you had.
Like, initially, I thought, okay, well, she's showing no emotion, but I'm an evidence man. I want to see evidence. And we find out later on that the fetal blood on the engine wall, which a world-renowned scientist that I think flew over from the UK was adamant was fetal blood. Well, when they checked, it was a chemical for sound deadening and all that type of thing. But plus also the fact that when I analysed a lot of Lindy's responses, she was talking in ambivalent sentences. So if you're recalling an event, a historical event, you'll go through in a chronological order, and usually truthful people's stories won't vary all that much. So I think also that it was a change. It was almost like a Lynch mentality,
absolutely,
by the mob, and it was like, I mean, you look at the media, and it's like everyone was baying for blood. And,
absolutely.
And you know, the reality was there was not a lot of forensic, scientific, or medical, or cooperative evidence
to back it up.
So, look, I always had doubts, and then after actually reading some of the transcripts and analysing the transcripts, I thought. Take out of the equation the fact that she didn't express emotion like you or I would, doesn't make her a killer.
No.
So early in the piece, I didn't see that evidence tying her in, and as we all know, later on she was part.
She was exonerated. Yes. Stephen Aperen, we could talk for hours because the subject matter is for me so compelling, very interesting to watch, to listen to you break down what makes people behave in a certain way. Please come back, let's do it again, and we'll pick different examples and see what we can identify. We wish you well in your current endeavours. Stephen Aperen, behavioural analyst, giving us a sense of how you break down evidence and the sorts of things you can look for to see whether people are saying the truth or telling you a lie.